do scientists get wrong about science? Hello and welcome to the fifth of our Bedrock interviews. We're joined today by Michał Paszkiewicz, one of our columnists who's been writing articles for all 5 issues of Bedrock about the history of science. Just a reminder that our March issue is now out. You can pick up a copy by subscribing on our website, bedrockmagazine.com. As long as you do it before June the 15th, you'll be sent one of these to your door. So without further ado, let's start a conversation. So, Michał, why don't we start with you? Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, how you got interested in the history of science?
Yes, absolutely. So I started off this interest, I guess, when I studied at university, and I studied theoretical physics. And I followed this up with a postgraduate diploma in science and religion, which covered a bit of the history of science and a bit of history of religion, how they intertwined, how they may have had various conflicts and so on. And after this, quite a while later in fact, I got into astrophotography when my friend gave me his old telescope, and I was taking photos of the moon, and I was looking at the moon and I took photos, and there were all these craters, and all these craters were named after a whole variety of people, scientists, philosophers, but a lot of them were named after priests and Jesuit priests, and this kind of intrigued me. Where did all these names come from? And they came from a man called Giovanni Battista Riccioli, and he named the lunar craters in his 1651 Almagestum Novum. And this book has never been translated, so people didn't really know why he named these various craters after these various peoples, what he thought. And I thought, well, someone's got to translate it, and I embarked on a strange journey of spending 5 years learning a bit of Latin to trying to translate these words that he wrote, and he's written an incredibly long book, so it's probably going to take me another decade to finish translating all of them. And in this process, I've acquired a sizable library on the history of science and astronomy, and it's gone from there essentially. This is where my interest has come from.
Wonderful. And certainly the articles that you've written for us about the history of science have been very well received from our readership. The first article that you wrote for us was all about Aristotelianism, harking back to the Greek philosopher and scientist Aristotle, and talking about why we should reclaim some of the language that he was using in how we do science, and in particular this idea of teleology. Would you like to go into some more details about why you think Aristotle's thinking is useful for us today?
So in a way, in some areas of science, we have never fully abandoned Aristotelianism. So the idea of teleology, that there is a purpose to certain things and this is a property of them, isn't something that has been wholly lost in all of the sciences. In physics, you may not necessarily think of a particle and its need for a purpose where it needs to be satisfied in some way. But in biology, you would still talk about organs fulfilling a certain purpose. Why do you have a heart? To push the blood around your body. Why do you have a kidney? To filter out your urine and all these other things. So in biology, we've always kept a kind of Aristotelian thought, while there's been a kind of worldview that it's been abandoned, which isn't entirely true. And in a way, we haven't abandoned other ideas that we've had in the past either. And Aristotelianism, in many ways, works with very kind of simple everyday life things. Aristotle, for example, argued that heavier objects fall faster, and everyone will know this to be true. If you drop a bowling ball, it will land before a feather. Now, this may not be true in a vacuum, but that's an edge case of the broader everyday life case. And this is how science progresses. It's always been that we have a set of rules that function, a set of examples that work, and when we find the edge cases where our knowledge doesn't work anymore, that's when we progress with science and when we develop it and make it better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this idea of telos, this purpose that things have, you argue very convincingly is a very important property to think about. And you argue against this idea of reductionism, reducing things to that we're studying to just their matter, just what they're made out of. What do you think are the dangers of this kind of reductionism?
So reductionism has come kind of naturally out of the fact that we have discovered more and more things as we've delved into learning about smaller and smaller things. And this is true for our developments in chemistry, and then in particle physics, and then in nuclear physics, and so on. So as we've gone into smaller and smaller objects, looking for the atom, the smallest object possible, we've learned a lot of things about the nature of reality. Now, at the same time, there is a danger in that we may think that as we get smaller and smaller, we're kind of discovering what causes everything. And in a way, there is a way of looking at a more fundamental part of nature. Every time we go into the smaller, we seem to find a more fundamental part of nature, but it's often misunderstood in the sense that if you have particles doing something, they don't cause what's happening at the macro scale. They're happening at the same time. They're just a description that is more detailed. In the same way, if you had a map of soldiers moving around on a battlefield, the map is not caused by, if you have a bird's eye view and you see a whole platoon moving, the platoon moving it's moving at the same time as the soldiers are. They're not, one isn't caused entirely by the other, although obviously they're related in a way. So there is a problem with this idea that if we keep looking into the smaller and smaller, that we lose sight of the wider picture and how that matters. And physicists often have a problem of thinking that everything can be reduced, everything can be created out of the small, that everything can be explained that way. But a more, what we would call a realist position, is that we accept that the sciences at various scales are real. Biology isn't false because you could derive everything from physics perhaps, and somehow that would nullify biology. That's not true. Different properties seem to work at different scales, and we don't quite understand why either. So there is an idea that perhaps there is something called an emergence, that with lots of small things, sometimes a bigger property can emerge out of that can be studied at a different scale. So, for example, if you have one ant, it can move around in a funny pattern. If you have many ants, it can build an anthill. You can't build an anthill with a single ant. It's different properties do seem to emerge, and with ants in particular, they can have a circle of death. If you have enough of them and you put them, you can actually have them moving around in a circle and they never stop moving until they all die. It's a bit of a funny scenario, but it's not something that would happen with a single ant, because they have actually a very interesting pattern they follow, the ant walk, that actually lets them explore an area really well. So there's this idea of emergence, and perhaps this is why we have different sciences that work at different scales, where we can investigate different subjects without having to resort to looking at the bits that comprise it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I suppose that would chime with a lot of people's experiences of studying science in school, where you'll learn in physics, for example, Newtonian mechanics for GCSE, and then you get up to A-level and you realise actually this is all completely wrong, or you start bringing in various different quantum things or the theory of relativity or whatever. But you might argue that actually it's not wrong to say that this is what we're studying and this is a property. It's just right at a different scale or in a different context.
Absolutely, and Newtonian mechanics isn't exactly wrong. If I threw a ball at you, it would observe the principles of Newtonian mechanics. It doesn't have a relativistic effect, because if it did have a relativistic effect, it would have to be either really big, really heavy, or really fast, and any of those options would completely vaporize you. Whereas if it followed the principles of quantum mechanics, it might tunnel through you, or it might hit you from multiple sides at the same time. So it's not really wrong. And in fact, scientists today will still use Newtonian mechanics for many things. If you're modeling planetary motion, usually you don't have to resort to relativity. You can resort to Newtonian mechanics, and in most cases that will solve the problem you're looking at. When you start looking at the other more detailed sciences, when you are in their domain, and this is part of the problem of science, is you have domains and you have to know which which laws apply in which domains.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this idea of kind of purpose and emergence at different levels is a big thing you're trying to rekindle among scientists. In addition to which, you've written about the loss of wonder, and some people might call it enchantment or re-enchantment, and you sort of go into this in your article all about the harmony of the spheres, this traditional idea that the different planets and stars somehow have a kind of music. They're all in tune with each other along. Could you go into more detail about what is this wonder that you think has been lost, and how does it affect how we do science?
So, in many ways, scientists have become very rationalist, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We've benefited a lot from rationalism in being able to study nature around us. However, the same rationalism is quite a narrow worldview. It doesn't allow for much mystery or for different perspectives on how things work. And I think for a historian of science, it's particularly interesting because historians, we have to look at how people thought in the past. And so you have to adopt a number of mind views and be able to know which ones applied when and try to think about whether they are applicable today and so on. And if you think about how Aristotle, Pythagoras, or later on Kepler or other 17th century scientists were thinking about the world, they had a far more mystical worldview. In many ways, what they thought would be considered occult, and it would be rejected by the rationalists of today. While at the same time, if Kepler saw the ideas of quantum mechanics or the ideas now being advocated for in string theory, he would find this more mystical and magical than anything he had ever thought of. So we have, in a way, almost turned everything into spreadsheets and numbers and not seen the mystical side of things. Not to say that that scientists are wrong, it's just that they have a different perspective on how things work and just, I guess, their sense of wonder around it.
And yes, I think that's very important. And one phrase that really struck me when I was reading your article about the harmony of the spheres was you said that we should be smitten by the reality around us as we learn to harness it. That it's not an either or of trying to understand reality or cultivating the sense of wonder and awe at it. You can do both at the same time, and that's what science should be. And I suppose your criticism of this sort of rationalist, very, very logical, dry way of looking at the world applies also to a lot of the way that ordinary people look at their everyday lives. How do you think people could maybe rekindle that sense of wonder in their lives from this much more rationalist, everything can be explained, to a sense of the beauty of the mystery around them?
How can they do that? That's a very interesting question, and it's quite hard to explain it. I think if you try and create a rule for it, you're almost already breaking the attempt. So I mean, I think you can think about it from everyday perspectives. I've got 3 children. Now, you could be really rationalist. You could learn everything you can about child psychology and try and figure out how they think and what you can do to statistically, improve their chances of doing this or that. But then you can also be a parent who loves, who tries to support them, to protect them, and all these other things that are more natural. They're not scientific. And this is kind of what I'm getting at. There is always a more poetic way of approaching things that is equally as important as the understanding underneath. And that's not to say that that's studying child psychology or other things to try and help our children isn't a good thing. Absolutely, they're very good. the whole point is putting it in perspective and benefiting from it in a broader context where other things are also important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And the sort of the synthesis between those two is a very interesting one, in my opinion. In your so in addition to this sense of this purpose that we should regain in science, this teleology, and also this sense of wonder and amazement at the world around us, you also write about our ability to know things and our ability to make accurate models of the world around us. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I read it as you're encouraging a kind of healthy distrust of your own way to understand reality, going into the example of epicycles, for example. What is an epicycle, and how can knowing the history of epicycles help us to be more critical of our own way of looking at the world?
Absolutely. So epicycles were an idea started by Hipparchus that were supposed to deal with the fact that you have planets that you can see in the sky, and that they sometimes move backwards, and they also shine brighter. Now, before epicycles, there were actually other models that allowed for what we call retrograde motion, which is usually a planet travels one direction in the sky, and then for some periods of time, it reverses. Now, there was something called the Platonic or Eudoxian model, and it allowed for this, but the way it worked was there were kind of rings inside rings, and they span, and it was a very complex arrangement to get a retrograde motion to work. And one problem with this model was that it couldn't allow for the planets to become brighter or darker or dimmer, because they were always at the same distance from the Earth. So these were all Earth-centric models. And Hipparchus brought in the idea of epicycles. So now you have a circular motion where there is something called a deferent, and along this deferent you have a point around which the planet moves in a circle. And in this way, you can account for the fact not only that sometimes the planet will go backwards along that deferent, but also it comes closer or further away, accounting for its brightness. And actually this works quite well, because when the planet is in retrograde motion, it's usually in opposition, which means it's at its closest point to Earth, if we think about this from a sun-centric perspective. And so that's why it's both brighter and also why it's going backwards. Now, epicycles were a success in this way. They were a lot simpler to deal with than the homocentric rings of Plato. And you could model them pretty well mathematically, make predictions. And after Hipparchus, we had Claudius Ptolemy. And Ptolemy, he added an additional thing. He added what's called an eccentric and an equant. So the eccentric was that in the deferent sphere, you have the Earth is slightly off-center. It's not actually in the center of these spheres. And the equant is a similar distance apart on the other side. And the planets move in a motion that follows an equal angle around this equant. Now, this dealt with a variety of problems of the fact that the planets didn't follow a very similar speed across their whole orbit. So the Ptolemaic model was highly successful. It allowed for predictions that were pretty accurate for over a millennium and a half. This model was essentially the scientific consensus amongst astronomers. And it wasn't as accurate perhaps as contemporary science. You had errors of perhaps up to 2 degrees, sometimes up to even 5 degrees for positions of planets. So the prediction compared to where they actually were in the sky were often off by about 2 degrees, which might seem like quite a bit, but for a naked eye, it wouldn't be that significant. And part of the problem was that a lot of these planets follow quite complex motions, as we learned over time. And so eventually, people were trying to figure out what was wrong with this. And the problem wasn't just the accuracy. The problem was also the fact that you have these orbits on top of orbits. This wasn't very nice in a way, because what the ancients had always thought was that circular motion was perfect. This is something you can read in Plato or Aristotle. Circular motion was perfect, and straight motion was the second most perfect, but circular was more perfect because it was eternal, whereas motion in a straight line had to have a kind of beginning or ending. It didn't make much sense otherwise, so it was less perfect in this way. So while circular motion was considered perfect, the fact that you had this equant, which meant that the planets no longer followed very simple circular paths, kind of seemed like they weren't so perfect, and people were upset by this. And then you have people like Copernicus who came along, and Copernicus didn't actually remove the epicycles. In fact, Copernicus used more epicycles than Ptolemy did. Ptolemy used 34, Copernicus used 38 in Commentariolis, which he released in 1514 to a bunch of academics. And by De Revolutionibus in 1543, he had upped this up to 48. And this wasn't because he wanted to make the model particularly more accurate. It was because he liked these circles so much, and he was trying to replace this equant with more circular motion, which seemed more perfect. Now, we only finally got rid of the epicycles with Kepler. Now, Johannes Kepler was working on much better data than Ptolemy or Copernicus, and this was thanks to a man called Tycho Brahe, who was a Danish astronomer who built a huge observatory, and he was funded by 1% of Denmark's income. So this was, a huge national scale project, and he gathered a huge amount of data. And Kepler worked on this data, and he was able to figure out that there was something not quite right, and he figured out that the planet Mars must follow an elliptical orbit. Now, an elliptical orbit can be described with different than an epicycle. This is a bit of a difficult thing to imagine, but actually a circle on top of a circle, if they have the right ratio of speeds, then the epicycle can add to the smaller one, and together they can form an elliptic motion. However, what an ellipse is it's a restriction on what possible epicycles can make the arrangement of a planetary orbit. So this was the huge change, and people had thought perhaps that epicycles were wrong, but the new ellipses were much better, and the accuracy they gave was much higher. You no longer had a discrepancy of 2 degrees for Mars after this. It was a fraction of a degree of an error, and so we can see that you can try and think in a certain way the beauty of one thing, and then suddenly a new way of thinking around something can cause vast improvements all of a sudden. And in the article, I was talking about this being quite similar to everyday life in a way. I think it's harder to see it in yourself, but certainly if you talk to other people, if you meet other people, often you can find that you can see what their flaws are, and you can think about, this is a problem that they have, but there's no way they will notice it themselves, not unless you tell them. And in a way, this is why we need a lot of dialogue between people, because you can always see something about someone else that they cannot see themselves. And this is always, when you learn your own flaws, this is when you can improve.
Yeah, amazing. And that's definitely something that all of us can build into our lives in some way through being able to adjust the way that we look at other people and deal with their arguments. And I suppose this is also applicable to the AI debate at the moment as well, with the way that large learning models are kind of having a constantly adaptive approach to picking up new information, and also people who are using them are having to adapt the way that they use them. And you mentioned that in your article as well. What do you think the impact of this way of thinking, where you can be flexible, you can be changing your mind? What do you think that the impact of that has on LLMs?
So LLMs are kind of surprising in a way at how quickly people are willing to switch to them in some ways, and it's not everywhere, because the average person probably isn't switching a huge amount of their workflow to using LLMs, and rightfully so, because LLMs, they give us a lot of power in a variety of ways. They give us knowledge in a certain format, but ultimately they're solving a problem. Given a set of words, what words will complete that previous set of words? And this is an immensely useful feature in a variety of domains. It's very useful for bringing out a set sense of documents, for solving a variety of what seem to be quite complex problems. We can actually generate code to various extents using LLMs. We can translate languages pretty well using LLMs. It's not perfect still. Still, if you have expertise in a domain, you will still outshine LLMs in that domain. But certainly LLMs will bring up the baseline for anyone else in that domain, because they already have a huge amount of knowledge and they can present it in a format where it can be useful. There's also a risk. Now, what is perhaps interesting is we have this kind of epicyclic worldview amongst some job providers, for example. People have been firing people. They've been shutting down parts of their company, thinking that LLMs will solve all the problems that were in that branch of their company, for example. And in some cases that may be valid, but in many cases it isn't. And in many cases we still need people to do tasks that are more complex than the LLM can solve, really. And this may be like that for a while. Then there will of course be improvements in AI, and it will improve on the tasks it can do. But there is perhaps this element that not only do we not want to be stuck in an old worldview, but we also don't want to see this new tool as a hammer and everything becomes a nail that we have to hit it with. So you can have this kind of epicyclic ingrainment, both in a kind of traditional view where you are avoiding changes, and also in a progressive view where you want to change everything based on a few successes.
Yes, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What would you say to someone who's starting to study science, maybe at university, or is a professional scientist in some ways, to avoid falling into some of these traps you've outlined in your articles? Is there a general attitude you'd recommend scientists take that's different to the way that lots of scientists look at the world, that you'd sort of say is a good overall starting point?
So scientists try to be very accurate, and they're very good at it. And part of the problem is, to become really good at a particular field, is you have to get into niche topics. You have to break up the subjects into smaller parts, and only then can you learn more about a very particular object. I think what is beneficial for scientists that you don't often get in the training at university is a better knowledge of the philosophy of science and a better understanding of the history of science, which can help you understand how we got to where we are and how we have benefited from that. And at the same time, you want to try and be open to other worldviews. Now, this is a very complex and controversial thing, because it doesn't mean that we need to listen to conspiracy theorists necessarily. But also, on the other hand, what we have lost is the ability to often answer quite simple questions. And I think one of the big issues with the rising of flat earthers or anti-vaxxers is that we are often not trained to answer the simple objections that we would have been able to answer in the past, because we've moved on almost, and the answering that kind of question is beneath us. And it takes substantial effort to answer people who are criticizing fundamental ideas, and you need to be able to defend them, especially if you think that that's right. So we need to be willing to debate people who are perhaps proposing crazy worldviews. And this is a very difficult thing to do, because if you're a scientist and you're working on a very specific subject, you are basing your research on a huge amount of trust that the things that came before was trustworthy, that the results were good. And you need to be able to defend those positions as well, to be able to be prepared for the people who may come and criticize you. And that is a difficult task. And unfortunately, his history of science is kind of underfed. And there's a lot to be done there to help defend us against conspiracy theorists, essentially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I suppose that ties in as well to ordinary people, non-scientists who don't have expertise in these domains, but who maybe have a vague understanding of some scientific theories. And you often hear this phrase, trust the science. Well, I suppose people need to actually know what the foundations are for the things they're trusting in as well. Do you have any words of advice to people who, like many of us, science is at the very heart of our everyday lives, the different medicines we take, the different, the computers we use, the vehicles we drive, all these things are powered by scientific discoveries that we have no idea about. Do you have any advice for people in those situations as to how they can maybe look at the science that they're using unwittingly in a more in a fresher light, maybe with more wonder, with more of an idea of what's going on there, but also with a more critical or a more sort of questioning attitude than just accepting it all?
Yes, I think everyone should be learning sciences to a significantly greater extent than we currently do. I think a lot of people think that you leave school, you leave university, and perhaps education can end there, you've done your bit. But actually, we have the faculty, we have the ability to learn our whole lives, and it's important to retain a sense of wonder that will make you want to learn more things, to learn things about them. And you shouldn't really be commenting on topics if you haven't studied them. It's worthwhile talking to people about these, but certainly thinking that you know better than experts in those fields is a dangerous move to make. And I look at doctors and the amount of learning they go through in a field that is absolutely vast, because you can specialize in so many niche subjects, and doctors have to be often generalized in a variety of these subjects, which is a very difficult problem. And the problem of human biology is incredibly complex. And to think that you know better than a doctor if you haven't studied medicine is just a bit ridiculous. So you have to trust the experts, but at the same time, we have to have an open dialogue in society where we know what the various issues are. And I think because we often lack a public open dialogue about various subjects, people start to think that science is somehow flawed in itself, which I don't think is the right conclusion.
Definitely, yeah. So we should all brush up a bit on our science from school. I think that's a great takeaway to have from this interview. And what better way to start your inquiry into science than by reading some of Michal's articles in Bedrock, including in this March issue with a wonderful article on calendars, which we haven't spoken about, just to leave that open to your own appreciation when you subscribe. Just go to our website and subscribe before June to get a copy of our March issue. Before we wrap up, as we're starting to come to the end of this interview, do you have any final words for our viewers, for people who might have been intrigued by some of your articles or have been forced to think about their own lives in a different way through this lens of science, for how to keep going?
Well, that's a very broad question. I think the articles speak for themselves, and I think the other articles in Bedrock are also very, very helpful. And it's really nice to see Bedrock as a project with the positivity and the idea of uplifting people who read it, which is quite unusual in this world where we often only hear dreadful things happening around us, and it's easy to despair. And I guess the message I would like to bring is a hope. And because we, in a way, have as a society lost a hope in science, a hope in general. I see it from the perspective of science, but the Enlightenment authors in the 18th century and so on, they had a huge, huge hope that science will teach them everything, that they'll be able to harness nature around them, do everything with this. And we've actually now seem to have turned the other way. We seem to think, well, perhaps we can't do the best job with looking after babies, and perhaps we should just kill them if a mother is pregnant and going to struggle financially. Or with a sister dying, we've seen the topic of difficult deaths, and no one has been talking about the idea that perhaps we should have a hope that medicine will improve and will be able to help these horrific deaths that have sometimes happen. And it's not a majority, it's a small amount, but they do happen. But surely there should be a hope that we can solve these problems. And they must be out of our imagination, but we have to have an imagination that it can happen. And I hope that's positive.
Okay, wonderful. Michał Paszkiewicz, thank you so much for coming. It's been a great conversation. And do check out his articles in all of the 5 issues of Bedrock so far. Thank you very much.